YB stays on your neck.
It's on my neck.
Yo, my dons, make sure you hit that like button, comment, subscribe, and obviously hit the bell for notifications. So as you see on your screen now, Lennox Lewis has rage tweeted one of his followers on Twitter. Now the follower on Twitter essentially said to him that he got his nut punched in by Vitali Klitschko. And this is, it makes me laugh because the guy he responded to has about 50 followers, and Lennox Lewis replied to him. This just goes to show, like, no matter how old fighters get, they still have that. I guess it's not just fighters, I guess it's probably men and humans in general, but you'd think at 50, 60 years old, you'd be thinking, you know what, if some yuppie teenager in his mum's basement wants to send me a tweet saying I got my nut punched in by Vitali, I'll let it slide, but he didn't let it slide. He responded, this man, Lennox Lewis, a massive all-time great, hundreds of thousands of followers, took his time out of his day to reply to a troll, and he said this, listen, keep in mind, I took that fight on 10 days notice, wasn't training for Klitschko. Now, I've got a few personal thoughts on this, because just number one, just let it slide, Lennox, man. I'm not, listen, Lennox won that fight for me because he forced a stoppage, but he was running out of gas. That's the bottom line. He was running out of gas, and ultimately, in my opinion, at that time, I believe Lennox Lewis was 37 or 38 years old, and I've got to be honest, I've always been a guy who champions rematches when there's a bit of uncertainty. When you're going 50-50, there should be a rematch. That's why I believe Floyd Mayweather ducked De La Hoya, because he should have done the rematch. De La Hoya wanted the rematch, but he ducked it. Yeah? And with that in mind, Lennox Lewis says here, he makes an excuse in that sense. Keep in mind, I took it on 10 days notice, wasn't training for Klitschko. So my question to you is, Lennox, yeah, if you could have put your hands up and said, yeah, it was a close fight, and left it at that, but you didn't. You chose to make an excuse, and your excuse is, oh, I didn't have enough time. I wasn't training for Klitschko. So my question to you now is, why didn't you rematch him then? Because if you'd have rematched him, you'd have had more than 10 days notice, and you'd have known you'd have been preparing for Klitschko, and therefore, there'd have been no excuses. Why didn't you rematch the young, hungry lion? And bear in mind, now, speaking in terms of what happened, or knowing what we know now in terms of his history, we know that Vitali went on to be, even though it was a weak era, but nonetheless, he went on to be essentially the lineal champion. In my opinion, Vitali would have beat Vladimir 100%. He was more nasty. He had more about him, in my opinion, than Vladimir did. That said, so yeah, with that in mind, Vitali was the man. So why that's relevant is, if Lennox Lewis had gone back and actually beat Vitali properly again, rather than all this other business, he could have actually put in, and he could have beat his era and the era after. Now there is still a level of question. Yes, he did get the win, but it was controversial. Most people think it's controversial, and also I think in terms of, as a competitor, Lennox Lewis, he could have really crossed that one off the list. He could have said, you know what, this is a young, hungry lion. And he didn't know, obviously, he didn't know at the time that, I'm sure if Lennox Lewis had known, or I assume if Lennox Lewis had known that Vitali was going to go on to be the all-time great, he probably would have said, you know what, I'll run it back now and cross him off the list. So then I can always say, I beat the generation after, but he hasn't got that in my opinion. He went life and death with Vitali, if the truth be known. And I think, actually, he probably would have beat him anyway. I just think it's weird that he ran off. He did run off. I know there'll be Lennox Lewis fans who are sour at hearing this. Lennox, the hater Lewis fans who are mad. But the bottom line is, he's sitting here making excuses to Twitter trolls about, oh well, I didn't do this. Well, if it was only because he makes out like, oh well, the only reason I went life and death was because it was 10 days notice. Well, if that's the case, why didn't you just rematch him and have a full camp? Because I believe, and this is what I never understood. People say, oh well, I only had 10 days notice, I wasn't training for him. Yeah, but he wasn't training for you either. He couldn't have been. You both accepted it on 10 days notice. And actually, I think I'm sure, I could have sworn Lennox was actually the one who had a fighter coming up. I'm sure it was Vitali who stepped in, but don't quote me on that, I might be wrong. I'm sure Lennox Lewis had the belts, and he was going to be fighting anyway. Does that make sense? Because he was the champion. If you're the champion, you can't be forced to fight. So with that in mind, what my point is, how can you have only had 10 days to train? Because you was the champion. Yeah? Champions don't get forced to fight by challengers. Or maybe it could have been. I guess it could have been a forced mandatory. But if it was a mandatory, you'd have more than 10 days. People don't spring and execute mandatories in 10 days. So I find that hard to believe. And actually, from what I remember, which might be wrong, but from what I remember, it was actually Vitali who came in off the street, actually with 10 days training, and got in there and actually outperformed himself. And then, either way, whatever way you want to say it, oh well, I didn't train. Well, where was the rematch? I think as boxing fans, we missed that rematch as well, because if there had been a rematch, both would have had a full camp, both would have known who they were fighting at the end of it, and they'd also would have had the first fight to get used to each other. But we didn't have that. So for me, there is not an asterisk, but did Lennox Lewis really cross Vitali off the list here? Is it enough for? Is it fair for Lennox Lewis to say, "Oh, I only had 10 days' notice"? Well, no, because you were the champion. You retired the champion. You could have given him the rematch, which he wanted. Anyway, I just thought that was funny. Made me laugh. Let me know your guys' thoughts, and your boy will be back.